So, video game movies. They've been around since the 90s, and yet for well over 2 decades, they were universally trash. Normally, I'd add a modifier like almost universally, but here, I think that absolute label might be justified. I haven't seen all of these, not even close, but even by the rough litmus test of Rotten Tomatoes, not a single video game movie managed a fresh rating until 2019. Not one. The highest praise most people would give these things are, yeah, it does some things well, but they come with a lot of issues, or it's nostalgic, but probably doesn't hold up, or it's so bad, it's hilarious. Throughout the 2010s, there were a handful of YouTube videos and other online discussions about why these movies were so consistently awful, blaming it on things like most video games' lack of story, the film medium's lack of interactivity, and the long length of video games being compressed into much shorter films. Some of these videos made the bold claim that game movies would never be good, that there was something fundamentally incompatible about the two mediums.
In my opinion, it's impossible to make a good movie based on a game. I'm serious, I think we should just stop trying.
Luckily for us, those people were wrong. In 2019, things started to change, with Detective Pikachu earning 68% on Rotten Tomatoes and grossing $450 million worldwide. Neither of those things are hugely impressive when it comes to the film industry overall, but for a video game movie, it felt like a genuine miracle. Detective Pikachu has its flaws for sure, but it managed to please fans of the franchise while also holding its own as a standalone film. Soon after, Angry Birds 2 and both Sonic the Hedgehog movies also saw moderate critical success, and the Sonic movies, along with Uncharted and Rampage, earned respectable profits. In 2023, the Super Mario Bros. Movie was a huge success, like 15th highest grossing movie of all time huge. We've still yet to see a video game film that's truly acclaimed by critics, or that I would consider to be truly great, but on the small screen, it's a different story. Before the late 2010s, video game TV shows certainly existed, but at least in the West, most of them were very obscure. The only one people really know for anything more than a couple of memes is Pokemon, and since that show is practically just as old as the games, it's rarely thought of as an adaptation. In the last few years though, we've gotten The Witcher, Castlevania, The Last of Us, and Arcane, which were all big hits and range in quality from pretty good to phenomenal. They're also very different shows based on very different kinds of games, and not only that, they differ hugely in how they adapt their source material. In current year, it's uncontroversial to say that the world has figured out how to make video game adaptations work. But it's still not clear how or why that happened. And in this video, I want to explore what creators might have started doing differently and what we can potentially learn from. One thing people might bring up is something that I've already alluded to. The best adaptations right now are TV shows, so TV must be a better medium for video game stories than film. And you know, that's probably true in many cases. Video game campaigns are often dozens of times longer than films, and compressing the whole thing down to just 2 hours can seriously dilute the experience depending on what you're making. The Last of Us translated amazingly well to serialized TV without even changing much of the story. At the same time though, not every game is The Last of Us. A lot of them really do have a very simple plot that can be compressed to a couple of hours, and if anything, might need to be fleshed out more. A lot of games also draw their appeal from dazzling visuals and thrilling action, and those things are easier to pull off on the big screen. To illustrate both of those points, let's look at the Mario movie. I definitely have my issues with the film, and I understand the mediocre critical reception, but for what it was, I think it succeeded. It was nothing more or less than a non-stop string of colorful action scenes that captured the spirit of Mario very well. And what impressed me most was how it made adapting Mario look so easy. Like, you could probably convince me that making this movie with Illumination's budget would take practically zero effort. Just steal the character and world designs from the game, hire big celebrities for the voice cast, write a basic-ass isekai and MacGuffin-based script, put Mario through an obstacle course of classic enemies and blocks, score it with some classic Mario music, bam, you're done. That's almost literally all the movie is, but that raises the question, if it's so easy, why has nobody done something like this before? Well, my best guess might be that until recently, nobody really tried. Despite there being a large number of video game movies in the 90s and 2000s, a large chunk of them came from just 2 directors. The first of those is Paul W.S. Anderson, the guy behind the Mortal Kombat and Resident Evil movies, who is otherwise most notable for having a name that sounds like a cross between two other, far more respected filmmakers. His movies might have the occasional cool action scene or one-liner, but even those are inconsistent. And as for his ability to direct things like actors, well...
There's no fire here! No fire! What's wrong with you?
This water isn't going anywhere!
What?
The other big video game movie director is Uwe Boll, who makes Paul W.S. Anderson look like, well, one of the other Andersons in comparison. It's incredible how this guy simultaneously seems to put zero effort into his movies and also have negative chill.
And if you write me, don't write me with some like bullshit nicknames out of the internet. Write me with your name and address so that I can track you down and rip you apart. Thank you.
Like, he's best known for completely inept adaptations of horror games like House of the Dead and Alone in the Dark that only got made because of German tax loopholes, but he's also literally challenged his critics to boxing matches and made a Letterboxd page full of one-star reviews that you can't tell me weren't actually written by fucking Borat. I'm sure there's some self-awareness to Boll's later shenanigans, like a wrestling heel kind of thing, but that doesn't change the fact that his video game movies were just awful. Not only that, but look how many of them there were. Dungeon Siege, Blood Rain 2, Alone in the Dark 2, Far Cry, Postal. These things were prolific enough that Boll's work defined the video game adaptation for a lot of people, potentially including other studios. I mean, can you imagine what some boomer film exec who hadn't played a video game since Pac-Man was probably thinking when they saw these things? Yeah, video game movies are just never gonna be good, right? They're all cheap trash slapped together to make a quick buck from clueless gamers. Best we can do is make more of those. It's been a slow uphill battle to get non-gamers to respect the gaming medium as an art form at all. Even the director of the Prince of Persia movie, who isn't an Uwe Boll level hack, has gone on record saying video games can't do human drama. It might have taken Detective Pikachu and The Witcher to break through that ceiling that kept video games from being taken seriously by Hollywood at all. It's also worth mentioning that Nintendo, who most would label as the single most iconic game developer in history, didn't touch Hollywood with a 10-foot pole until quite recently. The probable reason was pretty simple. The 1993 Super Mario Bros. Movie was a disaster, an absolutely baffling dystopian sci-fi movie where Bowser is Donald Trump and Mario refuses to jump? Hey, that rhymed! That's probably the most cohesive thing you could possibly say about this weird-ass movie. Anyway, Nintendo aren't exactly known for quickly letting go of their failures, so they left Hollywood behind for over 2.5 decades. If you ask me, their absence was sorely felt. Nintendo games have a level of multi-generational appeal that almost no others could match, especially 20 or 30 years ago, which can be an easy recipe for a massive crowd-pleasing hit. Most video game movies from the 90s through 2010s were based on darker games and tried really hard to be edgy, but still had pretty cartoonish stories and visuals that did not mesh well in film form. On the other hand, Nintendo games have always embraced cartoonish playfulness, which is something Detective Pikachu and especially Illumination's Mario movie really tap into. Outside of those Nintendo movies, we've seen other video game adaptations find success through multiple distinct paths. The Sonic movies are a little more out there in concept, being road buddy comedies that don't seem to resemble any major Sonic canon in terms of plot, but you can tell the creators really put the fans first. They were directed by an animator for the Sonic games, and the first one was delayed 4 months to redesign this abomination after internet outcry. People had the lowest of expectations after seeing that first trailer, but the creators actually listened to what their audience wanted and got their shit together, and both movies were quite well received. So Mario, Sonic, and Detective Pikachu were about pleasing the fans above all else. While that did work for those movies, they all played it pretty safe with their source material. And if I'm being honest, I don't think any of these have much reason to exist beyond seeing our favorite game characters on the big screen. Which is valid, I had fun with the Mario movie too, but I wouldn't call it a huge creative achievement either. You could maybe say the same about The Last of Us, but I feel like that show is reaching a new demographic in a way those previously mentioned movies just aren't. Like, my dad watched that show, and I don't think he's played a video game since Wii Sports Resort. The Last of Us is lucky enough to have an in-game story worthy of being adapted directly into a quality HBO drama, but not that many other games can really do that. The other success stories, including the only ones besides The Last of Us that I would actually consider great, have gotten pretty transformative. They each have a good reason to be more than just IP fanservice tie-ins, and they don't just take what the game does and port it to the screen. They do their own thing. The Witcher plays fast and loose with the source material to create an addictive dark fantasy series. Castlevania adds incredible visual flair to a similar genre, now serving as the IP's primary creative outlet after the games have been dormant for almost a decade. Though technically not based on a video game, D&D Honor Among Thieves uses gaming source material to give us, essentially, the best Marvel movie in years. The single greatest achievement has to be Arcane, which provides both fantastic animation and inventive, emotionally powerful storytelling from a game that most people probably didn't even know had a story at all. Video game adaptations have come a long way, and what might be most impressive is how much variety there is. In the 2000s, every video game adaptation was schlocky action movie. Nowadays, we've got CGI fantasy epic, prestige post-apocalyptic drama, schlocky action movie, sword and sorcery show, animated kids adventure, horror movie, kids buddy comedy, and we're only going to see more variety going forward. I mean, we're still supposedly getting a live-action Jason Momoa Minecraft movie. Nothing is true and everything is possible. With the MCU now well into its decline, there's been some talk about what might replace superhero movies as the next big thing in Hollywood. And I do think video game adaptations could take a big slice of that pie. There are only so many gaming IPs with Mario levels of name recognition, but peak MCU could bring massive audiences even to movies based on relatively obscure characters. If we see a few more success stories, audiences might get drawn toward video game adaptations in and of themselves. And we might just get to a point where, like, an Earthbound movie could be a major success. Although not actually an Earthbound movie, because Nintendo would never make that. Sorry to get anyone excited. I don't think video game adaptations will reach the massive heights of the MCU because 1, the interconnectedness of the MCU really was a big draw, and 2, these adaptations are still fairly hit or miss. The medium of gaming is so unique that bringing it to a pure narrative form is always going to require some experimentation, and not all experiments are going to be successful. That brings us to the most recent video game adaptation, Five Nights at Freddy's. This movie isn't great, but it had its heart in the right place. It understands what people liked about the games, we've got plenty of cryptic reveals, security cameras, and killer furries, but it doesn't just give us those and call it a day. As a movie, it couldn't possibly bring us the same interactive thrill provided by the games. To compensate, it leans more into its own medium strengths by fleshing out the human characters. We do end up with a lot of half-baked ideas that don't resolve all that gracefully, but I have to say I was more invested in the characters than I expected. The creators, especially the 2 lead actors, put some real effort into making a fairly ambitious piece of art. And with a little more effort across the board, that ambition could have been realized. Effort really is the bottom line. If you want to make a successful video game adaptation, just fucking try. If it doesn't work, respawn and try again. In the wise words of that one guy in your League of Legends lobby, get good.